Okay, it looks like it's at the top of the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Let me start by saying hello to everyone and welcome. My name is Sarah Macias, and I am so glad that you have decided to join us for Green Seminary Initiative's Eco-Liturgy Ritual and Worship webinar. If we can move to that next slide, Estrella. Serving with me as co-facilitator on today's webinar and as co-director with me of the Green Seminary Initiative is Abby Mohop. Abby is a PhD student at Drew Theological School and an ordained Presbyterian minister. Bringing care for the earth into worship services and spiritual life is an important part of seminary education. So today's webinar is the second in a series of 5 webinars that we have organized around the 5 focus areas of Green Seminary Initiative. These focus areas also represent the framework for our new seminary environmental certification program, which we will say more about at the end of the hour. If you missed the first webinar on eco-theological education, you can find a link to a recording on our Facebook page and our website. But before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items. As you get a chance to see our mission statement on the screen, please be sure that your lines are on mute unless you are speaking. Like others in this series, this webinar is being recorded in order for us to share it with others later, and muting will help to ensure a good sound quality. For the first half of our hour together, Abby will be guiding the conversation with a panel of 4 scholars who we will introduce in just a minute, and there will be a time for us to field your questions in the second half. Just select the questions and answer box on your screen at any time and text your questions about what any of our panelists talk about or any of the following topic areas. Today we will talk to our panelists about how seminaries can incorporate environmental themes into liturgies, rituals, and worship. We'll focus on how we can include content oriented toward care of creation, ecological degradation, environmental justice, and eco-spirituality into our seminary chapels and liturgy worship programs. We will also discuss worship competence and how to provide training so that students can develop skills and experience in creating sermons, liturgies, rituals, prayers, and music that include environmental themes and elements. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our panel. Along with Abby and myself, we have Heather Elkins joining us today. Heather is professor of worship, preaching, and the arts at Drew Theological School. Among her many books and publications, she has written a book that I've enjoyed called The Holy Stuff of Life, Stories, Poems, and Prayers About Human Things. In fact, in the last year, she has begun a YouTube series on holy stuff that I highly recommend. And Derrick McQueen is joining us. Derrick has recently earned his PhD in Homiletics and New Testament at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, after also completing his MDiv at Union with a focus on theology and the arts. Derrick is currently serving as interim pastor at St. James Presbyterian Church in Harlem and is a sought-after preacher. Lisa Dahill, we're so glad that she can join us today. Lisa currently is serving as associate professor of religion at California Lutheran University, but served 10 years prior to that as associate professor of worship and Christian spirituality at Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. And I would add that just out is the very timely book that she co-edited called Eco-Reformation, Grace and Hope for a Planet in Peril, since, of course, 2017 is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And finally, I'm so pleased to welcome Neddy Astudillo. She is the pastor of an ecumenical Latino ministry in Beloit, Wisconsin. As a Venezuelan American, Neddy has created and taught eco-theology courses for theological seminaries in Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, and the United States. She's also co-founder and on-farm educator at the Angelic Organics Learning Center. So, with that as an intro, Abby, how about we get started?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to invite Neddy to present first a little bit about how she sees liturgy and worship and competency happening around creation. And so, Neddy, if you...
And I would say we might want to remove the slide deck.
First. I'm sorry, I got a little bit
Yeah.
around. So Heather's going to go first. Neddy will go last. So you have a couple more minutes.
There we go.
Great.
You ready?
Yeah. So Heather, if you'll present, that would be great. The first question that we have for you is, what have you seen in seminary chapels or liturgy worship programs that are effective ways to focus on care of creation, ecological degradation, environmental justice, and eco-spirituality?
Okay, I want to name two of the basics that will be in any church and any seminary, and that has to do with stories and sacraments, because that combination is literally and symbolically the earthly and very earthy encounter between the human and the holy. So if you just think about how you get bread and the relationship of that healthy, holy human task, that teaching, that consciousness, that practice integrates so many of the principles that we hope to be able to model into what we see as living, symbolic life forms together. So the use of the arts in this work of both story and sacrament, I find critical. And I want to be very specific. I work best with specific examples. I'm going to direct the camera, for example, to a set that was designed, a communion set that was designed, and someone tell me if I've got the focus right. Okay. And this was long ago in the 80s. The United Methodist bishops issued a letter called In Defense of Creation, which had to do with basically denying the use of first strike when it came to that apostolic, sort of use of weaponry. It's ironic that we're back into that conversation again, painfully. But this was designed to be used in a communion service for the day that all pastors had to read that letter in defense of creation. And it brought people to the table in the reminder that we are only part of this creation. I want to then shift to another gift that the arts and sacraments and stories bring, and that has to do with this second, the importance of being able to invite a particular people into this conversation about worship. This is a dogwood set that was commissioned out of Kentucky. And the understanding of a region and people and the place of the organic, literally, and the identity of a people gathered at Christ's table. Some of you may know the legend of the dogwood and how that sort of underscores the image of Christ in an organic way. So this is both political and global and local, all in one piece. Another example from Nicaragua are the stoles that are being made by women that depict both their life and the life of their ecology, their place, in a vestment that is to help us lead in worship. So those are quick examples of the ways that arts, politics, and theology come together at the table. We only have to say the word water, and you think of Standing Rock, you think of Flint, and I think, because I'm from West Virginia, of the Charleston toxic chemical spill. So baptism and that consciousness of water as holy, and the threat of the toxicity of what we do as humans to that holy object, to that holy stuff. In the United Methodist Church, one of the vows is for baptism is a question: do you promise to resist evil in whatever forms it presents itself? So in the baptismal formula itself, in those questions and answers, consciousness can be raised in a community about the relationship to earth. I want to shift now to the training that you find helpful. I would say it's practice, 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 both the way in which you preside at a table, but the way in which you preside at a meeting when someone is presenting some controversial issues or some new information about very difficult conversations. And I come out of a rural background, so if I said 4 H's, you follow these 4 H's and model that, and they would be hospitality, honesty, humility, and humor. So both in the practice of worship and in the practice of educating about eco-theology, those four H's, I think, are really important in the practice piece. And one model that I want to point to sort of stands behind me, and it's how you can connect the work of St. Francis that is now coming into many, many congregations through the blessing of the animals. This is a particular Francis that is decorated literally bodily with the animals, plants, and insects of where we live at Drew. But the Pope's letter in defense of our common home, in care of our common home, the Pope Francis and this figure of Francis and the role that this saint is making headway in our congregations, again opens us up with a model how we might link both prayers and social action and a newly recovered focus on the season of creation.
That's really wonderful, Heather. Thank you so much. And sorry, I think we'll have time to hear more in a little bit. So thank you so much. And I particularly appreciate you showing these images and pieces of art about how creation makes appearances and ritual. So thank you. Now we'll move to Derrick McQueen. And Derrick is going to share some of his thoughts about worship and care of creation, how training happens, what challenges and obstacles have been encountered, and then opportunities. So, so Derrick.
Hello, how are you? I'm very excited to be here because I tend to think about how we can put things into our bodies, how we can recognize that the earth and embodiment are so similar, and how we really need to sort of connect those two. So for example, I'll go straight to an example. At Union's Edible Churchyard, there's a wonderful planting day where everyone sort of gets their hands in the dirt on outside chapels. Where we don't stay inside the chapel, we actually go out into our courtyard and get our hands dirty and sort of really bless the earth. And then we do our seedlings that have been planted by the edible churchyard that the entire community takes to their homes and nurtures for a series of weeks. And then we go and plant in the edible churchyard community garden so that there's a constant reminder that the seeds that we've taken care of are now being nurtured and that we will be eating them in the summertime. And so it's a way of physically enacting what it is that we're doing. I also love when we do our Sukkot and our at table, because we very much take the earth and take the earthly things and take the food and understand that it's all a part of how we sort of build community and understand one another. But theologically, what's important about coming around the table is to recognize that, you know, where everything has come from, as was mentioned before. And when we put that alongside of the issues that that we confront on a regular basis, such as Union is very much touched by the keepers of the mountains, as you know, in West Virginia, Caford Mountain, where there's an entire mountain that has just been devastated by the excavation of the mountain and the blowing up of the hills. And that imagery of that earth and of Mother Earth just being so ravaged has led to such rich liturgical understanding of just bodily mutilation of the earth. And it's been very powerful language, and it's been a permission-giving way to understand that we can be very very strong in our language about how we need to care for the earth, and not to be apologetic when we're talking about what's going on in terms of eco-justice. That's one of the most important things that I find that helps us to really embody and be embodied with the earth, and to recognize that that brutal language helps us to have an idea of what it is that we're really trying to call a lesson to and call a voice to, and to be aware totally of that. Some of the training that I see that's really, really important for me is to use the African American Orisha studies as well, and to use the idea of how water and the earth is always reclaimed as part of the ancestors, that the ancestors are speaking through water and speaking through the earth. So one of the things that I always love to teach is to say, what happens with that water of baptism if you're not doing a baptism in a pool? What happens with it when you finish with it? You know, very often what I'll do is I'll take our wonderful people and we go outside and we do a libation to the four corners and 4 directions of the earth in honor of the ancestors, to bring them in the blessing of the baptism of the child as well. So there's a connection to the historical and to the earth that is very tribal, that sort of fuses with the Christian notion of supporting that child who's now coming to the family of the church. And that's something that I find is like really very powerful. I also love writing liturgical prayers that always constantly make people remember that the earth is sort of not to forget that what we see every single day, especially living in New York City and pastoring in Harlem and teaching people to write liturgies that sort of find the nature where we are, and to find those little pieces of nature that can sort of exponentially sort of stay in our hearts and help remind us among all the concrete that we really are still a part of this natural world. And that's very important for me. I would say the challenges and obstacles that are often encountered, that I often encounter, is like there are so many other things to be worried about. Why am I going to worry about ecology? And so what I usually try and do with that is I try and say, I look at the earth as a container of what holds even our very liberation, by using the text of Revelation and thinking about how earth opens herself up to take what the demons use forth in order to save the mother of creation, and then I sort of liken that to, say, for example, Michael Brown's blood and the ground that soaked it in, and all of these sufferings that we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, that we are not forgotten, that the earth is holding our memories and holding our blood, and that the earth we need to take care of the earth because the earth is holding us, and the earth is really bringing forth some of our liberation. So that's also some of the opportunities that I see in thinking about understanding that the earth itself, that she's resistance. She's a resistance leader. And that if we follow her liberation model and resistance leadership and call upon her in our liturgies and our worship, wherever we are, even if we're walking in the streets protesting, that we are connecting our plight with the earth and calling upon the earth to help us. So we must then, of course, help the earth.
Great. That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Derrick. I love that idea of connecting our liberation and the liberation of the earth. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Lisa is next. Hello, Lisa. Sunny California.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you start by telling us about what you've seen in seminary chapel or liturgy worship programs, things you've seen that have been effective? Yeah, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you. I was 10 years at Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, where I taught worship and spirituality, including lots of outdoor courses, outdoor worship, outdoor spirituality kinds of courses, and participated in a great deal of worship planning and leadership as well. So I wanted to talk about 3 primary areas. One has to do with the use of indoor space, and then looking at outdoor worship, and then looking at text and adaptations. So in terms of indoor spaces, Trinity has two worship spaces, and I should say Trinity is one of the Green Faith seminaries, so I'm happy about that continuing relationship. So lots of attempts over the years and creative forms of bringing creation indoors with various waters, with rocks, with flowers grown in the garden, with even garbage and recycling and composting poured in the middle of the beautiful sanctuary on a tarp, with a service of confession and repentance, and then even a dumpster procession, taking this out to the dumpster, to the recycling, to the compost. So use of that space, a service of repentance as a font that had been running non-circulating water for 20 years, unceasing. We discovered in the process of our Green Faith audit was turned off prior to a recirculating pump being installed. So that's service of baptismal repentance and very concrete action of remediation. In our smaller worship space at Trinity, more contemplative services involving, for instance, the Holden prayer around the cross liturgy for the healing of creation. Very beautiful, contemplative, sung service, prayerful service of intercession for all of creation, named in very particular ways, changing each time. Or a seed box that a student created for the entire Lent and Easter season for that space, and taking it outdoors through the week for sun and rain. But a seed box, of course, is what a seminary is, right? Etymologically, a seminary is a seed box. So she made a seed box, and we prayed with it empty, and empty soil at Ash Wednesday, and the planting of seeds and watering of seeds and sprouting of seeds and blessing those every week through Lent, and their sprouting and their flowering through Easter. Was a marvelous set of metaphors around creation-themed contemplative services every Friday through those seasons in that space. The seminary also uses other indoor locations creatively. I can talk more about that. And procession as well, I wanted to just name. So a lot of kind of movement within the building and to different spaces in the building, according to whatever theme is being enacted, and out the door, so beginning indoors, moving out, and vice versa, into other spaces around the seminary. So then in terms of outdoor worship, again, I wanted to name three within that, and the first is just the seminary spaces themselves. So courtyards, the seminary has lots of different kinds of courtyards around it, 3 or 4 of them that were used in different ways according to what was in them and how that space might call forth different forms of ecological worship. From Arbor Day in a courtyard facing the street filled with honey locust trees, to a tree processional that actually began around the fire pit and moved from tree to tree to tree with, and with an adaptation of a Lutheran hymn called Earth and All Stars. We sang Earth and All Trees that day, and with prayers and movement to bless these various trees. Garden services, lots of those, as also Derrick mentioned. So too at Trinity, blessing the soil, blessing the seeds, blessing the sprouts, blessing the weeds, blessing the compost, blessing the produce, and the life of that garden at the seminary. And a big lawn on which we did a marvelous indoor-outdoor Eucharist that involved an offertory hymn that named predation and our own animal nature that returns to earth and sprouts again, a text by Margaret Atwood, sung as an offertory hymn. Libation as well as part of that service, returning the elements to the earth, as Derrick names with baptismal water, so we did with the bread and the wine following the service with libation-themed prayers. Trying to enact outdoor worship, not just as moving indoor worship outside with chairs and rows and microphones and extension cords and all of that, but trying to think liturgically with a given space and how texts change, how ritual changes, how very ancient Christian practices take on new forms in a particular outdoor location as the sense of community broadens beyond just our normal Trinity Seminary worshipers to include other humans walking by, to include birds and insects and grass and flowers and trees, and particular ones that we come to know by name. So this larger sense of community that comes to be part of the worshiping experience. So the seminary spaces, also including a Holocaust memorial that evokes a lot of really powerful sort of Holocaust theme or human suffering theme worship outdoors, but also baptismal remembrance. It's called Promise for Life, or other forms of street church kind of happening on this busy street corner with the Holocaust memorial where the seminary is located. So how can you use your own outdoor spaces in the most creative ways? So then there's sort of a second layer that I call wilder spaces, where for Trinity there's a stream flowing alongside. So moving out to this stream. It's still an urban stream. We're not in the so-called wilderness. We're in the middle of Columbus, Ohio, but there's this creek there, and it has its own riparian life. And so leading prayer on the bridge that connects Bexley, where the seminary was, which is a privileged location, very beautiful, with East Columbus, where there's higher levels of poverty and unemployment. And how does this bridge connect these very different human communities, not just divide them, but connect them? And then the creek is what forms this connection. So there's this perpendicularity, there's this crosswise connection of the natural life of the creek and the human tensions and bridges that our worship embodies. So worship on that bridge is powerful as well, right? And then worship in the creek, so taking students out into the creek, which occasionally happened in chapel, I think, but was probably more often happening in my courses, prayer services that students would lead or that I would lead, taking them out into the creek, baptismal events, taking our shoes off, getting to know what lives here, what breeds here, what kinds of trees are these, who lives here. And then one really powerful service that brought a lot of this together that a student led involved processing from the Promise for Life Holocaust Memorial to this bridge and then out toward the creek for baptismal remembrance, in which we also prayed both for particular creatures and animals by name, and also for all those humans who live in this watershed, including those who live without homes, in the permanent homes, who live in the watershed, literally, in the creek area. And naming those who had died in the past year by name, including one who had frozen to death. This was a frigid February day. We were standing in our very cold, in our warmest coats, bundled up for this service, praying for a man whose funeral was taking place that very day, who had frozen to death in this watershed. So, for lack of adequate housing. So the worship, immersing in this creek and in the larger human life, which leads then out into all the way out into wildness, fully into wilderness. So teaching a course at a camp.
Can I hang on to the wilderness until maybe we'll have time to jump into that in the question and answer time? Sorry.
Okay.
Interrupt you.
Okay. Do I need to? Is that the end? Or do you want me to say more about the training and the challenges part? No.
Not right now.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
There's much more to say.
I'm really interested in hearing what you're talking about, so I didn't do a good job of interrupting you. So
that's okay.
And I want to make sure that we give Neddy time to present too. So Neddy, will you tell us about seminary chapel and liturgy, training, challenges, opportunities? The floor is yours, Neddy.
Yes. So I think that what I have to share in some ways echoes a lot of what Lisa has mentioned already, in some ways on how to incorporate environmental themes, liturgies, rituals, in worship. I found three areas that I see myself working on. One is helping our students and the people of faith, people at church, to know their context. Second, to connect with their own eco-spirituality. And third, bringing the voices of the earth to worship, including vulnerable communities, vulnerable species. There is a gospel passage that I use as my guiding principle when considering what to focus on when we worship, or as we teach, or as we pray and do ministry with the earth in mind. And it is Mark 16:15, where Jesus says to his disciples before ascending into heaven, "Go now and proclaim the good news to all creation." So I tell my students that before sitting down to write a sermon, a liturgy, or prayer, that we need to know what is the good news that creation is awaiting to hear from the children of God. And here I echo Romans 8. We know that sharing the good news with other people as well as the earth is not just about preaching or reading the gospel. It's much more than that. And I think I echo here, and I've heard that it was St. Francis of Assisi who said, preach the gospel and use words only if necessary. So unless we understand and let ourselves be moved by the environmental crisis and its human underpinnings, there is not much we could say or pray for or do that may bring the necessary good news that the world is waiting to hear from us as children of God. And I was thinking that it is just like the training that we receive in CPE. clinical pastoral education. That is a requirement to become a pastor. We have to learn how to how to be with a person in crisis, right? If in the hospital, you're encouraged to see their medical file first, to know what the person may be going through in the moment. You try to get a basic background on things before you approach the person, and before you begin even try to pray for that person. You need to know first, what am I supposed to be praying for that person? And if possible, you create an environment so the person also has an opportunity to share her voice, her story. And you wouldn't dare to read the scripture either before you know what is the type of crisis this person is going through, right? So, and then you also pray for yourself, to ask God to help you understand how you can be a support to the others. So I think we need a similar type of CPE training for pastors, that may be called Earth Pastoral Education, EPE, that could teach us how to speak from and for the earth. So for that reason, when I teach eco-theology, I always ask seminary students during the class to choose and study an environmental issue of their choice, and preferably an issue of their own, that their own communities might be facing and going through. And second, another step, which is also used by Green Faith in the fellowship training program, and I also learned through my training, my dean at Drew, is connecting the student, the religious leader, with their own eco-autobiography, which is connecting with our own story in and with nature, our own sacred story, how we have also experienced the sacred in and with nature. And this is not just about listening to the earth, but it is connecting with our own voice in the matter of creation care. How am I impacted by the earth? Why is earth an important issue for me? Or even when did I stop listening to the earth? And I find this very important too, because scripture teaches us that the earth is not just a creature that we're called for to care for or pray for and protect, but the earth is also a partner in ministry. Earth has lots to teach us that would also help us understand God and our place on this earth. So finding the good news for the earth is learning to listen, and including in that listening those intuitions and that knowledge that we gain, and bring it to our stories as we preach, and in the lyrics of the songs that we sing or that we create. So again, what has worked for me is first to connect to the stories around us, to our context. Second, to connect with our own personal story. And as we do that, we begin to feel the struggle of earth as our own struggle. We are more clear of what needs to be changed in our communities, what needs to be lifted up, what or whom we need to pray for, what do we need to lament, where is our place in the situation that we have at hand. And if the temple is meant to be the microcosm of the universe, then who else needs to be included in worship inside the temple that we have kept outdoors, marginalized, unprotected? And as we connect with the stories around us and our own story, then we're more clear also as to what scripture we should bring and read to shine light on the situation that we are talking about and becoming aware of, or what relationships need to be amended in our community, or how is Jesus calling to reconcile people with the earth and with God. So, and the last point then I wanted to bring up is that since care of creation is also caring for the biological and the human diversity of the earth, if a group in our community is being threatened or marginalized because of their religion, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation, the color of their skin, or their legal status, the reality is that that reality has also need to be included in the conversations about creation care, environmental justice, eco-spirituality, and exposing ourselves to a diversity, to the human diversity of the world and in our communities, especially the vulnerable members, is also a great way to prepare pastors for EPE, Earth pastoral education.
I love it, Neddy. And that's where I have to put pause on you, and I think that's a great place to stop. I love the idea of EPE, and can't wait for you to start that program so I can do that.
I think that's our next certification program, right?
The next certification program. Sarah, I'm sure we have questions from.
Yeah, we've got one from Emil at Drew, who asks, what strategies have been useful for including, at least symbolically, the non-humans within the ritual state. So not just having non-humans in the space, but actually present and included in the minds of the participants within the ritual state itself. So do any of our panelists have any thoughts to respond to that question?
One strategy we used in the rite, I mentioned the indoor-outdoor Eucharist at Trinity involved, the movement from indoors to out. Indoors was the word part of the service, including the sermon, and then the movement out was at the time of the sharing of the peace. And so it was an invitation to go out and share the peace with preachers we meet outside, and to listen for God's peace from them as well. So inviting people specifically into encounter sharing peace, touching, hearing, seeing, and receiving as part of this movement in the service.
I would say also the reclaiming of the Psalms, because the creatureness of creation is so present in those ancient songs, and as that also shapes our prayers, we borrow back what another wiser generation understood. The other thing is, I think it's very important in sermons that our primary subjects not be human all the time, because I think they're very powerful narratives that can be drawn from the life of squids or cockroaches or birch trees, and how they survive, how they make community. So in those ways, I think the biblical texts that name creatures in prayerful, powerful, musical ways, as well as how we preach, who is given voice in our sermons.
I would agree with you and say that, especially with the Psalms and the songs that speak so beautifully to how the creatures of the world sort of give us a sense. For example, one of the major things that carries many of the people that I work with is just the image of the sparrow, and just that whole song, God's eye is on the sparrow. It engenders so much more than I can even ever say about a human being or a human relationship, is that relationship of how God deals with nature and how God cares for nature and how we're aligned with that. So I believe that there's a good basis of things in many of the songs that we sing.
It was mentioned before too, the blessing of the animals, but indoors, inside the temple, not outside, if possible. It's very powerful. Another thing that we've done here at the church is that we all, every year we invite, on St. Francis of Assisi Sunday, we invite a wildlife rescue rehabilitation center that is near us to bring one of their animals into the sanctuary and to tell us a story, what happened, and to connect the suffering of that particular creature also with human activity, and then we also connect it with scripture. So it's just kind of trying to find a way to bring those the rest of the earth back into the temple. That was one way.
Great. Another comment for keeping us mindful of non-human that was mentioned by Peg at Drew, said that sound and recordings can be played. So thanks, Peg, for that comment. A question from Melissa in Dallas. Why is it that we need to especially include the vulnerable in the community as part of our eco-spirituality practice? Why the community at all, and then why especially the marginalized?
It's biblical.
Right.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And also from my perspective, it is the marginal, once again, that are sort of tended to and taken care of by the earth when all else is ignored of those who are marginalized. there very often is a connection with the earth, where whether it's food or whether it's finding a way to sort of exist when substance is not given to you, finding another way to do that. I keep drawing back on my own personal African-American history, is especially with the African-American Heritage Cookbook. When you read the works of Booker T. Washington, and he's talking about how they grow and how they grew the greens, and how they grew all of the things in the earth, and they were given earth that was thought to be dead, that it would never grow anything again, and yet these marginalized people, in terms of learning their education, set themselves at their hands into the ground to actually replenish the earth, and it was the earth that replenished them and actually gave them an education to move an entire generation of post-slave folks out into the world and to be successful. And I often find and see that the marginal, folks in marginal communities very much have some sort of a connection with the world and with the earth that sort of sustains in a way. And I think it's important to lift that up, that is a survival tool of sustenance. And even in the Hush Arbor back in the day, where do you worship? In a place where you won't be prosecuted. You worship in a place where the trees will hold your sound for you.
Echo and Derrick, I think it is important because there is a wisdom to be learned as we come closer to vulnerable communities. If we want a just society for all people and for all creatures, as we connect with those who are vulnerable, we understand much easily what's wrong in our society and how can we bring that peace and that shalom that would include everyone.
And from important, rich traditions in Christian spirituality, just this consistent witness that the vulnerability of those who suffer and of our own suffering and of Earth's suffering is precisely where Christ is most intimately found.
Very nice. Thanks. Lisa, you'll be interested in knowing that one of our participants, when you were speaking about the creek there in Columbus, was commented about how powerful that story is, and she said that she used to serve the community on the other side of that bridge. So anyway, small world.
All right. Wow.
Any questions that the panelists might briefly have for one another? Now's a good chance.
I have a question. Derrick, you mentioned out of the Black Lives Matter experience and that powerful image of Earth holding the blood of those who have bled, and that movement moving into protest. And I was, in preparing for today, thinking, of course, a lot about Standing Rock and the deep connections between water protection, prayer, and protest. In fact, hearing from those who have been there of the consistent, belief mantra of that community that this is not a protest, this is prayer, it's all ceremony. Yeah. And so Derrick, or either of the others of you, what connections do you see between prayer and protest, especially now? And how can our prayer itself participate in the protest we need today as prayer?
Yeah. Very often, there was a protest here in New York City where we laid down in the intersection. And it was sort of that connection with that cold, hard earth that actually gave us that connection to the earth that was underneath. Of course, because New York City is a huge rock. So it wasn't like there was even any softness underneath it, but it was just cold and it was hard. But it was the singing and the singing as prayer that lifted us up. And the singing as prayer that sort of gave us the connections as we were lying there on the street. So there's a lot that can be done with singing and prayer as protest, and just touching nature, touching the ground. And I remember scooping up at another protest the next week when police officers were killed, scooping up a piece of earth from the courtyard at Union, and we marched down to the police precinct in solidarity. And I just remember encouraging people to leave a trail of dirt as our prayer that it comes from the seminary to the police precinct, about 7 blocks away, and how powerful that just that dropping of the earth on the city sidewalks was as a moment of connectional prayer between the two. So it's very important to sort of figure out ways to embody prayer with earth and embody prayer with the atmosphere and protest. And for many protests, that gets lost. But that's the basis of many of the protests from the beginning.
I do think that's a gift that Standing Rock is giving us, a reminder that prayer is the way in which community is built between peoples and earth and the future, and their clarity through their visioning that if they practice prayer as a form of nonviolence, there was the possibility that the harm that was going to come to many might be averted. So that trust in the work of prayer. And I also think, we go back to Genesis, what makes us human is the giving of breath. That's when we became human living beings. So the work of human breath and the work of prayer are so deeply linked with creation itself, with our very being, our life. And I just want to say a little counterpoint. I would, recommend Drew is sort of walk this path. I hope we go down this path a long way, which is that we require classes in Native American history and present, because that's an original sin that we in North America are going to have to continually address. It's so deeply rooted in our misappropriation of earth. So the curriculum piece that comes with prayer is important.
Good. Thanks, Lisa, for lifting that question up. Any other panelists have questions to ask of each other?
Well, I just wanted to say today, looking at your faces and hearing your voices from a distance, helped with the paralysis of the news today. It did feel, if you just began listening to those voices and the reporting as to what's going on in relationship to earth and peoples, that it was a hard day to do this kind of work. And I found a poem that I posted, I think you have, and it both helps me break the paralysis, but it was also a way to break paralysis to hear how you're carrying on your work, the liturgy, the work of the people. I'm really grateful for the presence.
Agreed.
Thank you for that. Well, each of you will have a chance for a couple of minutes of a closing statement if you have one, or if there's some, if you didn't get a chance to offer any thoughts to some of the questions that Abby asked you. So we'll have time for that, unless there's any other questions you'd like to ask of each other right now. If not, let's.
I would just like to say, as I'm thinking about working with Latino seminarians as an immigrant myself, I know that one of the other important aspects of working with the Latino community here in the United States is giving people the right to love the land, regardless of their legal status. So one of the tools, also methodologies to somehow incorporate these environmental sensitivities into our worship lives, is also connecting immigrants to opportunities to love this land, to visit farms, to reconnect with their own indigenous roots, with their own love for growing the food and raising their families in the countryside, in el campo. And that's also been very powerful and very transforming for many pastors, especially Pentecostal pastors that have been taught that they needed to put aside their love for the earth and then just focused on a vertical relationship with God, saving souls, but really realizing that it's not just saving souls, that the earth also is in need of help. And also realizing that their indigenous roots, their love for the land, is part of their spirituality and is part of a way in which God has been teaching them and talking to them about love for the earth and love for each other. So That's just another way, bringing back that spirituality of the land, and also the right to love the land, which is dignifying a call for immigrants regardless of their legal status in the United States.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions from participants. Let me offer those real quickly. And Christopher has asked, how do you see incorporating feelings of fear and helplessness over the big challenges, and we've already kind of touched on that a little bit, over the big challenges that human civilization faces in light of climate destruction? How can eco-liturgy help with confronting feeling frozen or apathetic? We've touched on that a little bit already, but just in a brief moment, does anybody have anyone to add to that topic?
I wanted to say one of the reasons I thought the poem was important was exactly this. When you read it, it can literally call forth a sense of despair. It names the threat. And yet the very work of hearing the poem read or perhaps being able to pray breaks the paralysis. A long time ago, Peggy Way, a great pastoral theologian, said, you know, we get so bombarded, we have filters that are so deep. It's like we do put our bodies, our minds to sleep just so we can survive. But if another narrative that is contrary to yours gets through, it's like it begins to wake us up. We begin to feel. Now, what we first feel is pain. And then we have to decide, are we going to stay awake or are we going to move through it? So I do think this is where the arts and poetry and the prophecies in, say, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos help get through that paralysis. It names and creates a sense of fear, and then it enables us to rise and resist the threat in both ways.
That poem is now, it's in the chat box, so everyone has access to it. It will also be on our Facebook page.
Right.
I would also name, with reference to outdoor worship in particular, how important that is, in that we're so much of the paralysis I experience and despair comes from a sense of unreality, of policies being enacted that are completely out of touch with reality. And so I find it spiritually urgent to move into connection with reality, which the arts do, and those biblical prophecies do. Yes, Heather, thank you. And also being out in the outdoors in the real world does. And to the extent that I let myself get caught up in devices and distractions and virtuality and texts and all of that, I can go crazy or paralyzed. And my experience in moving with students outdoors into worship is that even though it's hard and it might be cold or it might be a hassle or whatever, and it has to be planned in a way that so that people can hear and can participate, and it works in this place and with these people, and all of that is hard work. But the experience is often just so joyful and exuberant. There's a playfulness often about it. There's a sense of spontaneity and creativity and aliveness that has often happened when worship moves outdoors. And I find that experience really important, that we're so cut off from the natural world. There's a cultural theorist at UCLA, Jenny Price, who uses the language of we're losing track of nature. We're so cocooned. And of course, many people have analyzed that, but just the physical reconnection with the natural world in worship, I think, is primal. It's primal.
And for me, that's where the hope is in that, is that it's once I step outside and even in New York City, if I take a deep breath of that air, there's something that re-infuses me with the reality that nothing outside is really controlling that one moment that I'm connecting with nature. And that's a hopeful moment that I hope to stretch into the future of reality. And that's sort of what keeps me moving through my fears, stringing together those moments of hope through nature. I looked up at a ginkgo biloba tree at the change of seasons out in front of the church, and there was this bright yellow in front of this bright blue that was just earth-shattering.
Mm.
And that is an image that I carry with me in the middle of New York City, that you can see these two beautiful, distinct things. And it just sort of eased this fear that I was going through that day. And knowing that the earth can give me that kind of hope helps me to extend that spiritually in my life as well. And I try and sort of help people look for those images, even if you're just looking over the Hudson River, over an overpass, to realize that 100 years ago, a farmer looked over that edge and wanted to bury his son there, who fell, because he knew that if he kept that place sacrosanct, that his son would always have that view of the Hudson. And I go there for peace and for hope and for joy. It's an incredible way of dispelling that fear of touching base with nature from my perspective, and teaching that.
And as we do that, I feel that the challenges that we have before us today is also inviting us and calling us to connect with people even from other faiths, connecting with others who maybe we thought were different to us, but in reality have the same heart and are beating for the same earth. And so we can find our commonalities and come together to find the ways to solve some of the issues that we have before us, which are greater than any of us, any religion. And so we need to just come together at this time. And there's hope when we do that too. It's amazing. It's beautiful. So
Very nice. Abby, how are we doing on time?
I think we are nearing the end of our time.
I don't want to stop.
I know, we have just 5 minutes.
Can we just keep on?
Maybe we can do a sequel. Maybe we can get these 4 people together and do a sequel. I'm really grateful that this is recorded so I can listen to it again. And yeah, and I'm so grateful to each of you 4 panelists for
Really?
sharing your wisdom and grace here. So Sarah, I think we're ready for you to
Yeah, we need to get ready to move on. That, as we mentioned earlier, today's webinar is the second in a series of 5 webinars that's being offered every 2 weeks. The topics are selected based on the 5 focus areas of the Green Seminary Initiative, and the next one is on building and grounds. It will be held 2 weeks from today, on Wednesday, February 8th, from 5 p.m. until 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To learn more about it and future webinars and to register, you can go to our Facebook page or our website. Or you can always email us at the greenseminaries@drew.edu email address, and we can get you that information. To those listening, if we did not get to your question, and I think we did, but if we didn't, or if you think of one later, just send us an email. So we want to stay in touch and continue this conversation. It's very meaningful and very timely. Finally, if you and your school are interested in learning more about our seminary environmental certification program that we mentioned, there is an orientation webinar being offered 1 week from today on Wednesday, February 1st, from 5 p.m. until 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The application